Hello and welcome everybody to our last panel of the conference, which is a very diverse panel of scholars from 3 Western European countries and Belarus that spans their topics, span 4 centuries of Belarusian literature, and I'm looking forward to this very, very interesting discussion. Shall I introduce myself?
Yeah, introduce yourself. And those who are on the panel, you can sit here as well.
I'm sorry, I haven't introduced myself to begin with.
It's on this side, but
So just very briefly, my name is Karalina Matskievich. I'm a researcher in biblical studies and one of the trustees of the Francis Skaryna Belarusian Library and curator of the library and museum collections. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. His name is Professor Alessandro Achilli, who is a senior assistant professor in Slavic studies at the University of Cagliari, Italy. He received his PhD from the University of Milan in 2015. Between 2017 and 2020, he was lecturer in Ukrainian studies at Monash University, Melbourne, Australia. His research interests include modern and contemporary Ukrainian poetry, Ukrainian cultural history, Belarusian literature, Slavic studies, comparative literature, and literary theory. In his current research project, he traces and analyzes neo-modernist trends in Ukrainian poetry of the second half of the 20th century. He is the author of the first monograph on Vasil Stus, published outside Ukraine, and published numerous journal articles in Harvard Ukrainian Studies, Zeitschrift for Slavistik, Canadian Slavonic Papers, Modern Language Review, and Studii Slavistici. And the title of Dr. Alessandro Achilli's paper today is Alhierd Bacharevich's Poetry, Making Sense of Vieršy. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Karalina, for your generous presentation, and thank you very much to the Belarusian community here in London for welcoming me and us over these 2 days, and especially I really like today's location. I'm really happy to be here. As Karalina mentioned, the title of my presentation is Alhierd Bacharevich's Poetry, Making Sense of Vieršy/Vierši. So, yes.
I cannot see the mouse, you see, and this is why I cannot show your presentation, unfortunately. I don't know whether there are any more IT competent people than me, but you see, I'm moving it and the mouse is not showing. Just have no idea. Maybe I'll just disconnect the screen.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, but you can keep
Sure.
the working.
So, as most of you here know, Alhierd Bacharevich is one of the most acclaimed and productive writers of today's Belarus. And by this word, of course, I mean a cultural project based on identity and not the current Belarusian state. Bacharevich is the author of several books of prose, some of which have been or are being translated in other languages, including German, English, and French. His best-known novel is arguably Sabaki Europi, which has been defined as a Belarusian 1Q84 by Tomasz Kamusella, with reference to Haruki Murakami's 2009 dystopian novel. In my paper, I will focus on Bacharevich's poetry, a less visible yet important part of his literary output. Bacharevich has been writing poetry since the mid-1990s, when he was active in the post-Soviet Belarusian neo-avant-garde. Yes, I see my slides. In spite of Bacharevich's long career, not only as a prose writer, his first poetry collection came out only in 2022, and that's the book I'm holding. Vieršy/Vierši was published in Prague by Viasna, and includes more than 30 poems written between the mid-1990s and 2021. with most texts being dated 2020 and 2021. The most striking feature of the book is its language landscape, so to speak. With one exception, all texts are presented in two versions, Latinka on each left page and Tarashkievica on each right page. This means that readers will likely get the impression that Latinka is the primary, the most authentic form of Belarusian writing, at least for the author, while the Belarusian version of the Cyrillic alphabet, although in its more traditional version, is just a secondary rendering, a transliteration, or even a translation of the original Latin. Thank you so much. The only exception is a text that presents a music score on the left-hand side and a poem in Balbut on the right-hand side, being Balbut a language that Bacharevič created and used in the framework of his novel Sabaki Europe. My focus today will be on certain recurring themes in Bacharevich's poetry, with particular attention to issues of community and communication, two words obviously united by the same etymological root. The poetic reflection on community and communication plays a central role throughout the book. The second poem of the book, titled Bojowe Mastactwo Technik Żlobin Mięsk and written in 2018, is centered around the coming of age of a minor community that, against all odds, has been able to maintain its identity and its critical outlook in the context of a larger hegemonical group that constantly threatens the smaller, endangered one. And I will now quote some excerpts from this rather long poem. It's on the third slide, if we manage to open it. So
we're sharing the screen. Yeah,
okay, I will start reading it aloud. Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Ледяные танки, подъемные краны и краевид по-солдатску засланы. Як оцарели мы, дивная справа тут живучи. And then, треба глядеть сериалчик московский, треба отчуть себе чаской масовки, быть як усе. Як у окопе, залегчу в охоне, побач с живыми людьми. Твар свой сховать за под шкланком, за киндлом, за пирожком с подозронным повидлом у палитон. У адмысловае наша маўчанне, менскае кніжнае тайна адчайне, чуюць яго пасажыры звычайня, б'юць у чыгуначны звон. Менск, як руіны няісных палацаў, вырасці тут баявое мастацтва, ну а далей проста нудная праца не забываць, што жывы. Як мы не з'ехалі з глузду ў той цемені, выжыўшы між іх тычэлага племені, цела убогіх цалуючы вырасці, як мы смаглі непрыкметна так вырасці, як ацалелі мы тут, як не сталі мёртвымі танкамі мерзляю сталлю, думаеш, млосць. Взялись аднекуль сілі вярнуцца, проста адно у аднаго захінуцца, усім ім на злосць. From the point of view of postcolonial and especially so anti-colonial approaches, Bacharevich's own intimate Belarus, that is the community to which the lyrical subject describes himself, is a threatened island of normalcy and vitality in the context of a colonized wasteland that turns everything alive into a lifeless matter. The Belarusian other, from the point of view of the civilized, one would want to add European lyrical subject, is characterized by its regression into a state akin to wilderness, stichelaje plemia. The Eastern orientalized other Belarus, whose decay cannot but be the result of a colonization process successfully undertaken by an unnamed colonizer, is depicted as suspicious of the resistant efforts by the endangered minority. Resistance is linked to writing, which in its turn is related to silence, a silence that worries the colonized majority, prompting it to press the alarm button. With its clear-cut division between us and them, Bojowe Mastactwo Technik Żlobin Mięsk anticipates later poems by Bacharevič, such as Suprativ, which is centered around Slavicist Max Fassmer's silent resistance against Nazis in pre-war Berlin, and even more prominently, Vosyani Avos My, one of the poems of the summer of 2020, which also gave the title to an anthology of Belarusian protest and solidarity poetry published in Russia in 2021. And that would be on the next slide, if possible, please. Here I will quote a rather short excerpt from this poem. Хэти город ніби хірургічний разрез, а вачей не сховать, не 200. Паховання у хэтай країні живцом, заплавання ущент найвищейшим жрацом, вигадаєм на 100 або 200. Якби ти не боявся власної криви, коли чуєш живє, коли ласка живі, да тривай, то є ми, нечакана є ми, до другого прищастя. Vosyani Avos My reads like a continuation of the portrait of the two Belaruses of Bojovoje Mastatstvo. In 2020, however, the other, secretive, free, uncolonized Belarus is not hiding any longer. While in the 2016 poem, dissent had to be hidden and the subject was not able to openly show his face in public, as you will remember, Var svoj schovat za pašlankam, za kindlan, za piraškom, s podozronim pavidlam u paliton, Vosyani Avos My prompts the community not to hide itself anymore. Avache ne schovat, nie 200. And while in Bojovoje Mastatstvo, even the silence of the oppositional subjects was enough to jeopardize their safety, in Vosyani Avos My, the lyrical subject invites the members of his energized community to both speak up, that is, communicate, and to care for their own well-being in a context which hasn't obviously ceased to be authoritarian and intimidating. I argue that the opening image of the surgical wound that the revolutionary community shouldn't ignore can be read in more than one way. It's at the same time an explicit image of the city's suffering, of the physical and psychological pressure to which the Belarusians are constantly exposed to, but it's also an image of healing, of care, of connection between body tissues that are expected to stop aching and degenerating. The revolting subject, both individual and collective, should both take care of its own safety and not be afraid to take to the streets to be seen and heard. In this regard, and with reference to the image of the wound, we can also read Vosyani Avos My as part of an intertextual net of poems centered around aching, wounded bodies yearning for visibility and recognition that stretches from Janka Kupala's A Kto tam idzie, one of the architects of modern Belarusian culture, to contemporary Belarusian poetry. For example, Yulia Timofeyeva, who also happens to be Bacharevich's wife, with her Urok Cierpliwości, among others. The dynamic of silence and communication is central to the lyric narrative of Bacharevich's book of poetry. The subject frequently evokes silence as both a natural result of the impossibility to communicate brought about by the Belarusian authoritarian state and an escape from the deafening rhetoric of the official language. Moreover, silence is linked to both the impossibility of speaking up and out in the authoritarian context of today's Belarus and to the at least temporary lack of audiences and interlocutors that may be seen as a natural consequence of a more or less forced emigration. In a poem titled Emigracja, next slide please, the lyrical subject depicts a scene at a barber shop in a German-speaking country. The barber asked the subject to speak English, ich spreche kein Deutsch, nur English, and the unexpected language shift prompts the subject to recall some moments from his home past as a Soviet child. The subject focuses on the things he was afraid of while coming of age, which included, as you can see, мужчинских сльозов и зимовой мєнської немоти, усіх, хто хета хуч нахаварив, на вуха не чекаючи отказу. Як мне хотелося тоді хутчей сівєть, як мне хотелося ослепнуть і оглухнуть, як мне хотелося утечи і написати такую книгу, каб усьо нарешті змовкло. The book that the subject was dreaming of in his younger years is depicted as a way out of the deafening noise of rules and expectations. In this poem, the lyrical subject presents writing and literature as an alternative to the empty but aggressive rhetoric of everyday life, especially in an authoritarian context. The book, which the subject can write only somewhere else, having abandoned his origins, is a space of freedom, a weapon able to protect the subject from the damaging effects of a corrupted language. True communication, if at all possible, is more of a utopia than an actual expectation, and it seems to be achievable only through the medium of literature. In a recent interview in which he looked back at his life path and his career before 2020 and 2022, Bacharevič shared with readers that literature shouldn't or cannot ignore the present and the challenge it poses. Next slide, please. Robił помилки я, головною помилкою не тільки своєї, а усьої літератури я лічу тое, що ми спробували жити і писати так, нібито жили у демократичній державі. Я позбігав некоторих політичних темаў, бо мне не вельмі цікава было писаць на злобу дня. Я бачыў задачу мастацтва ў тым, каб не скочвацца да злабадзённасці, не ствараць актуальнага мастацтва. Не хацелся ствараць візы будучыні, мне хвалявала тое, што хвалявала пісьменнікаў у іншых краінах. Літаратура гэта заўсёды пра эрас і танатас, пра смерць, бол і каханне, пра ўладу і прамову, пра самоту і час. Магчыма, гэта было памылкаю. Можа, варта было пускаць у сваю творчасць больш журналізму, публіцыстыкі. Бо пакуль мы так хацелі быць не горшымі за заходнюю літаратуру і пісаць пра вечнае, фашызм у Беларусі умацоўваўся, набіраўся сілаў і рыхтаваўся да таго, каб нас знішчыць. In these lines, Bacharevič posits literature as an instrument of resistance, one potentially able to prevent the spread of authoritarianism and fascism. The ironically utopian character of such an approach to literature is, of course, up for debate. What is certain is the importance of literature for spreading awareness of Belarus among international audiences, especially in such challenging times. And just before concluding, I forgot to mention that as I mentioned, this book, Vieršy, is basically a parallel textbook with Latinka and Tarashkevica. Yesterday I had the chance to buy the second edition of Sarmatia by Maria Martisiewicz from Iher, and I saw that this book is also a sort of bilingual book, Latinka and Tarashkevica, but here it's constructed in a different way. You basically have the chance to read the book as you prefer. So it's not parallel text, but it's still two versions of what is maybe the same text. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter today is Hanna Horn, who is a doctoral researcher at the International Research Training Group Baltic Peripetties, Narratives of Reformations, Revolutions and Catastrophes at the University of Greifswald. She is also visiting researcher at the Faculty of Cultural and Social Sciences and Public History at Fern University at Hagen. She was born in Minsk, Belarus. She obtained her specialist degree in literary writing at the Maxim Gorky Literature Institute in Moscow. In 2022, her research interests include Slavic literature studies, digital humanities, autobiography online, and digital dictatorships. Hanna's present PhD project analyzes life writing on the Belarusian section of the internet by net, both as a literary fact and a historical document. And she focuses on the life writing motifs and strategies of four authors: Alhierd Bacharevič, Marisa Martisiewicz, Dmitry Strotsev, and Tatiana Zamirovskaya. And Hanna's title today is, just a second, is The Motifs of Emigration and Nostalgia in Facebook Prose by Tatiana Zamirovskaya. Welcome, Hanna.
Yeah, thank you, and hello everyone. Thank you, Dr. Karalina. I would like to share my screen, if it's possible. And I'm happy to present my work at this panel. I'm more than happy to do that today. I hope you can see that. Yep. Digital autobiographical writing from democratic and non-democratic regimes has the ability to respond quickly to social political changes and transformation processes. Together with the function of transactory memory partner, social media platforms can also become partners in oblivion or erasure partners. Indeed, when political repression takes a significant place in digital realm, as we also learned yesterday from one of our colleagues, this phenomena reinforces the removal of content and thus affects authorial writing online. In my presentation today, the motives of emigration and nostalgia in Facebook prose by Tatiana Zamirovskaya, I want to take a look at how mentioned motives as part of general social and political transformation become more or less present in the author's writing online. As it was mentioned, I'm a part of research training group Baltic Peripeties at the University of Greifswald. Tatiana Zamirovskaya is a Belarusian writer and journalist. In her fiction texts, she works with themes of absence, oblivion, digital immortality, and resurrection. Her works include the short story collections Life Without Noise and Pain, Sparrow River, Land of Random Numbers, and the novel Death Net. In 2015, Zamirovskaya lives for the United States, not yet knowing for how long. MFA at Bard College, life and work in the US, intensification of political repression in Belarus, one might say can be seen as a leading points in one's realization of emigration. Due to the preliminary content analysis, distant and close reading, I have divided this brief journey in 3 reference periods from 2010 till 2024, and you may see them on the slide. It is also important to mention that these topics of emigration and nostalgia are not specific to the Facebook writing of this author, but they're also present on her Instagram and LiveJournal pages. So going closer to the first period of 2010 to 2015, I have named it Irony and Nostalgia. In her Facebook writing of early 2010s, she frequently refers to the Belarusian reality in an ironic manner. One can also spot a nostalgic tone in her posting, though at first glance it may not be clear where this nostalgia comes from or where exactly it is leading. Here I would argue that we are dealing with ironic nostalgia or second-hand nostalgia, as kinds of and methods of literary alienation. As well as many things, nostalgia is political. It is, quoting Mitya Velikonya, a retrospective utopia, a wish and a hope for a safe world. End of quote. And though Velikonya writes about the sentiment addressed to the image of the USSR, his remark is also applicable to the period of independent Belarus. Again, quoting him, nostalgia is an essential companion of every significant social change, transformation, transition, revolution. For this reason, it is widespread in complex and fast-changing contemporary societies. Here, Zamirovskaya refers to the idea of Belarus as a peaceful post-Soviet so-called social state. And I would say that it has this kind of connection to what was mentioned before when Bacharevič writes about trying to live in democratic Belarus before 2020. And at the same time, state repression and violence are perceived as mundane and expected. The preparation for and the presidential elections of 2010s themselves are presented in humorous way or ridiculous sides of found of them, supposedly making them even less similar to the real elections. With this ironic nostalgic tone, one could argue the author seeks to escape from the traumatic everydayness of repression and unfreedom. It can be perceived as nostalgic writing addressed not to the past, but to the unrealistic image of the present, closely linked to the Soviet past. Moving on to the second period of 2015 to 2020, Immigration Revolution Hope. The year of 2015 marked the year of Zamirovskaya's immigration to the US. Also, in March of this year, the memory function or on this day function was introduced to Facebook. Although these events are unrelated, Memories about places of Belarus do emerge in the writer's Facebook feed. The experience of author's emigration can be summarized in the following reference points, and here they might be treated as subpoints of this period. The first one being that when Zemirovskaya visits New York from time to time, sharing her impressions as a tourist, and also the attempts to reflect on changes in Belarus from distance are frequently accompanied by a realization of gradual decay in the homeland. For example, news about the densification of real estate development in the neighborhood where she lived, or concerts in the botanical garden with heavy light and sound pollution. Nostalgic motives, this time connected to her own presence in Minsk, come with the drawings or photographs of the Akademkniga botanical garden neighborhood. At the same time, precisely because of this homeland's image disintegration already in 2018, she writes that she has nowhere to return to. The ironic attitude to Belarusian reality is also preserved. You might see it on the screenshot on the right, where she reflects on being the same age to be eligible to be a presidential candidate, but in Belarus, it can be treated as eternal, unrealized possibility, a sacral figure, the true point of manhood and maturation of a real Belarusian. The next sub-period in this time frame is that when, together with her studies at the Bard College and the job in the candle boutique Trudon, gradually comes the realization of emigration. Belarus in general and Minsk in particular remain to be a place where time goes by but nothing happens. The temporality of Minsk and Belarus in its inherent landscape are the phenomena Zemirovskaya sought to comprehend and capture. Herewith, they often find the writer in the form of a seeming comparison between a place in exile and a familiar place in Belarus. The everyday life, changed in emigration, is routinized through an occupational novel, or rather work notes, if we speak about the genre. As already mentioned, the first time in New York, she works at the Candle Boutique, where local celebrities or just interesting and eccentric people drop in from time to time. Days at work are often described as comical or absurd situations that fit well into the partly ironic image chosen by author narrator. And for some time, she collects such work-related notes on her Facebook page and then makes a separate Telegram channel, naming it the Apocalypse Candles or the Candles of Apocalypse. A thorough writing also helps to keep in touch with friends in other countries. Nevertheless, internet space is no substitute for being close to loved ones. In her Facebook posts, Zemirovskaya often writes about her presence in the US as a strange after death, a flickering non-existence for others. Later on, she compares it to a blurred, distorted image on the screen. And here I propose two quite lengthy quotes. I will not read it in full, but a blurred to general picture of the arrangement of things. Things and objects seem to be guessed in this blurriness, but they were guessed not as such, but as an idea of their eternal unidentifiability, their ongoing indistinctness, which is now their permanent quality, acquired due to the destruction of the contours by the flickering mechanisms of memory. And the next one is when she compares the visit of friends to New York like to her own funeral, to one's own funeral. And it's also nice, and you seem to be near, and it's all about you, but no, after all, not really. The third sub-period is after 2015, when her usual journey drags on 6 months. The questions arise in the comment section. You can see them on the right. Her friends or colleagues ask if she's there forever or for a long time, and if she's planning to come back to Minsk. Tanya is no longer going back, but she sees Belarus and American landscapes. And these central memories of Minsk carry a spectrum of different emotions with them, from nostalgia and feeling of safety to insecurity and fear. These memories can be triggered by a number of things, from weather, nature, and architecture to more complex feeling conveyed by the terrain itself. Here, just a couple of screenshots on fog, a little bit of Minsk. Then here's how well they drew the New York underground with the feeling of Minsk's one, and also writing about the unsettling feeling that she was landing in Minsk. Following Zemirovskaya, one can argue, you never know at what moment you will get to Minsk and what Minsk it will be. On this slide, you can also see that it's not only this image of Minsk, but which she remembers, or if she or which haunts her, if you may, but also other places of Belarus, for example, Brylovskaya Pole or Lagoysk on the left, and memory of Minsk and the feeling entangled to it might also be quite vivid and tangible. On the right side, you might see the dream she describes in her Facebook writing. And coming closer to the most recent period of 2020 till 2024, between hopelessness and hope, post-apocalypse and nostalgia, I might say that throughout her first years in the USA, Zmirovskaya comes up with different ways of naming the immigration limbo, this state in between. She calls herself and other fellow immigrants temporarily privileged snobs, refers to herself as music critic in exile, and states that she has just temporarily removed herself from Minsk. She may also identify as a non-belonging object. And I must say that it's not a stable identity, but rather a variety of authorial ways that she approaches this experience. At its turn, the year of 2020, not only in Zmirovskaya Facebook posts, but in other users' internet testimonies of that year around the world, this year can be read as a chronology of a catastrophe. The feeling of limbo, which began for Zmirovskaya in emigration, spread out during COVID and post-revolutionary situation in Belarus. If we turn to her printed works, for example, the novel Death Net, while talking about it, the author mentions so-called writer's arc. This text began as a personal immigrant trauma story, but during the editing process already in 2020, it became a universal one. With COVID and quarantine, revolution in Belarus, and increased political repression, Russia's full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, among other things, this time presented a global alienation of everyone from each other, as Zmirovskaya puts it. Later on, she writes of state of things in Belarus as, quote, unfinished catastrophe in progress, a definite sense of weariness with violence. And however, if before the summer of 2020, the temporal regime in Belarus was perceived as containing nothing in itself, afterwards, despite what might have happened, as Zmirovskaya points out, it became expectant with possible changes. In her article about activist hope, Anne Rigney recalls Walter Benjamin's exceptional Jetztzeit, which can change the course of time. Quoting Anne Rigney, by breaking loose from the continuum of events, they acquire the potential to become retrospectively the beginning of a different history. End of quote. The intensification of state violence made nostalgia for Belarus before 2020 impossible. Belarus before 2020, as I tend to read it in Zmirovskaya's texts, as an outcome of protests, was overshadowed by a pre-existing reality that became more present. Thus, this nostalgia about unrealistic present turned into a reality that never existed, into ghostalgia. Queer temporality of political repression leads to the simultaneous for the first time and everlasting event. As Zmirovskaya writes, and when it happened for the first time, we don't even remember anymore. It lasts for some damn bad infinity. Immigration becomes a writer's impulse to rethink life in Belarus, and it also opens up speaking from trauma. Speaking from this point on a larger scale as evidence of social processes allows the existence, or rather is a prerequisite for emergent frameworks of memory, as Anne Rigney draws from social frameworks of Halbwachs. Thus, using the example of autobiographical online writing of Zmirovskaya, one can trace how the remembrance or memory regimes of Belarus change throughout the last 14 years, making space for or eliminating the possibility of nostalgia. Coming to conclusion, I would like to remind the audience that political repressions in Belarus is not a phenomenon of the last 4 years, but a system that has been systematically adjusted and has been gaining momentum throughout the last 30 years. Thus, I'm taking a closer look into the gradual change of autobiographical writing of Belarusian authors online, among other things, as evidence of temporal and societal transformation. Considering immigration and nostalgia motives present before the escalation of state violence in 2020-2021, it's important to analyze the possible reactualization and fading of these motives or narratives. And 2 points of my conclusion is that routinization and normalization of immigration take place in Facebook writing. This writing also gives the opportunity and space or distance for speaking about other traumas. Nostalgia and remembrance are closely related to the social political context. Feeling of nostalgia is actualized or ceases to be relevant, also dependent on the political situation in the country, and hence nostalgia proves its political nature. Thank you for your attention. That's all from my side. Could you please unmute yourself? I think we cannot hear you, or...
Yeah, we cannot hear anything in the audience of the library.
So sorry about that. Thank you very much, Hannah. And I will announce our new next presenter now is Alesia Mankouskaya, who is a first-year PhD student and film editor at the Slovo journal at the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, UCL. She's a director and actress with 20 years of professional experience in performance and theater history. She completed her BA degree at GITIS, Russian Academy of Theatre Arts, and master degree in performance from Trinity Laban Conservatoire in London, focusing on performance and comparative studies in early music and contemporary performance. Her passion for theatre studies and history motivates her specialization in the development of professional theatre in Belarus and Ukraine during the early modern period, with a particular emphasis on Jesuits drama and professional dramaturgy. Alesia's title today is Exploring Early Modern Academic Drama, Simeon of Polatsk's early play and its historical legacy. Is it working, the microphone?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Karalina. And we are going to jump very much in history and dive into 17th century. So, great. Yeah, the first one is not very necessary, just the title, just in case. So, Samuil Emelianovich Petrovsky Senteanovich, Simeon, the name he received when he took monastic vows, was a professional poet and dramatist of the 17th century, a polyglot who wrote in Old Belarusian, Latin, Polish, and Northern Russian. He is considered the founder of two literary genres in Russian literature and the creator of the first example of syllabic poetry in Russia. There is a considerable body of work and research dedicated to heritage of Simeon of Polatsk. However, most of the research explore the theatrical legacy about the play written when he was at the court of Tsar Alexei I. I will discuss the work of Simeon of Polatsk written before he became a court writer of Tsar Alexei. This will include poetry and his early play Verses on Good Friday, when the shroud is taken out. This play was found only in 1982. The play written by Simeon of Polatsk approximately in 1655. The play written in Polish with choruses in Old Belarusian, and it follows the rules of Jesuits' academic drama writing. I suggest that the Simeon of Polatsk's creative works should be considered within the context of the European cultural tradition, acknowledging the influence of Neo-Latin poetics and academic drama on the poet's work. Simeon should be viewed as a Belarusian poet and writer, a continuator of European Baroque traditions. Should we go to this? Yes, number 3 straight away. That's it. Simeon Petrovsky Senteanovich was born in Polatsk, Belarus, then the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. As you can see, that's actually a map when we see Polatsk as it was when Stefan Batory entered and conquered the city. Is very well developed and actually very important city of that time. After the victory of Stefan Batory, a year later, the Jesuit monks opened here a college, and in 1585 was opened a college theater, perhaps one of the first in Belarus. The college accepted children of any faith, and education here was free of charge. Samuel Petrovsky Sitnianovich was born in December 1629 into a merchant family. He likely received his initial education at the Polatsk College, which is at that time provide primary and secondary education, admitting children from the age of 7. In 1641, at the age of 12, he was sent to study to Kiev in Kiev-Mohyla College, the best Orthodox educational institution at that time. I should say when Simeon was studying there, Kiev-Mohyla still was a college. It didn't receive the status academy, despite the fact that it was perhaps one of the best and the highest Orthodox education in Eastern Europe. The education in Kiev-Mohyla College was based on the teaching principles of Jesuit college and academies and was conducted in Latin. They have very little subject in Greek, and actually they have very interesting habit. They forbid students to speak not in Latin even when they were not in the lessons. So let's go next slide. Doesn't want to. Here we are. That's Mohyla himself leading the students, and actually when Simeon entered Mohyla still was alive. In Kiev-Mohyla College, Simeon learned academic drama principles and poetics, which were taught according to the books written by Jesuits Pontana and Skalyga. In 1651, Lithuanian hetman Prince Janusz Radziwiłł captured Kiev, and activities at the academy were suspended. This prompted Simeon to go to Vilno, where he continued his study at Vilno Jesuits Academy. Actually, some researchers suggest that he became a Catholic. It's not exactly correct. Vilno Academy as well accepted pretty much all Christians, but it's possible that here Simeon became a Basilianian, because we can find in his older books, in his books which were left in his library in Moscow, that he signed Ex libris Simeonis Petrovis Sitnianovich Hieromonachii Poloncesis, Ordis Sancti Basili Magni, Anna Domini, Milis Sextini Septuante a Augusti Virginis Sex, which means from the books of Simeon Petrovsky Sitnianovich, Polotsk hieromonk of the Order of Saint Basile the Great, in the year of the Lord 1670 on August 26. In 1654, the war again between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Moscow began, and in July 1655, the troops of Voivoda Cherkassky hetman Zolotarenko captured Vilno. Next. Here we are. What we see on the slide, that's unfortunately not the Polish Brotherhood called Epiphany Monastery. That's one of the most well-known cathedrals, Sofiyski Sobor. Simeon, at this time Samuel, returned to his hometown, when in 1656 he took monastic vow under the name Simeon and began teaching in the Polish Brotherhood School, located in Epiphany Monastery. With Simeon's arrival at the monastery, a small yet highly talented group of poets and writers emerged, including hieromonk Philotheos Utkin, Ignatius Ivlevich, and the pupils of the school Vasily Yanovich and Sava Kapustin. As a result, the Polotsk Epiphany Monastery and its brotherly school transformed into an important cultural center of Belarus. While it maybe not became a rival of Jesuit College of Polotsk, where among the teachers were the renowned poet and Baroque theorist Mateusz Kazimierz Sobriewski, it at least created any kind of counterpoint, a certain cultural counterbalance. Simeon, advocating for peaceful reconciliation of doctrinal religious differences, never openly criticized Catholicism. Perhaps the most characteristic feature in his poetic works during his teaching period in the brotherly schools was his sincere love to his hometown as his homeland, Belarus. Next slide, please. That's manuscript, the original manuscript, which was found in 1982. The verses from Belarusian period exhibit a clear graduation both in time and the linguistic basis. This period includes Polish Latin verses from Simeon time at the Kiev-Mohyla College, Vilno Academy, and Belarusian verses written by poet during his subsequent 8 years of teaching at the brotherly school at the Bogayavlensky Monastery of Polotsk. A significant portion of Simeon's Polish Latin poems belong to scholastic poeziae doctae, poetry for learning. The school poetry of the 17th century allowed for a humorous, light-hearted approach, sic movere et delectere, ut docere, to move and delight in order to teach. And Simeon eagerly employed humor to accomplish didactic tasks. His verses in Polish also embody traditional Baroque imagery. A genuine example of Baroque in his poem, Variety of Diversity of Time, where the wagon, or rather a cart of life, is depicted in symbolic and allegorical details, interwriting ancient mythological characters with biblical figures and heroes from medieval knightly romances. Simeon of Polatsk was undoubtedly familiar with poetic teaching of Neo-Latin poet Matei Kazimierz Sorbijewski. This is confirmed by Simeon's outline and brief guide to poetic, preserved in his Moscow archive, which represent a compilation of excerpts from the section on witty poetry, De Acto et Arguto, of Sorbijewski theory. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, alongside Jesuits, Catholic, Reformed, and Uniate schools, Orthodox fraternal schools with courses in poetic and rhetoric were also established. While all these educational institutions formally adhere to the regulation of the school charter of the Jesuits, which called Ratio Studiorum, they deviated from the same school in Western Europe in the main aspect, the compulsory use of Latin in creating example of poetic works. Dialogues for rhetorical exercises were composed and preserved not only in Latin, but in Polish and all Belarusian languages as well. And we have next, please. As of today, the earliest known theatrical piece attributed to Simeon of Polotsk is the Easter Dialogues, Verses for Good Friday, believed to have been written around 1655. The writing date is inferred from the concluding cryptogram of the manuscript, which I examined. This manuscript is preserved in the manuscript department of the State Historical Museum as a part of the Synodal Assembly collection in Moscow. The texts in the collection are written in Polish and Old Belarusian shorthand and partly in the semi-cursive script of the 17th century. Among the other manuscripts contained Simeon autograph, the Easter Dialogues, Verses for Good Friday during the procession of the Shroud, composed in bilingual format. In this work, the playwright employs not only two languages, but also two alphabets. As you can see, it's very interesting, yes, that even Simeon of Polotsk was using Cyrillic and Latin. And we should say that speaking at this time, Polish language was understandable for many Belarusians, and Belarusian language as well, as we remember before, was the official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Simeon plays belongs at the vast body of theatrical dialogues that's emerged in the intersectional of practical rhetoric and poetic. Just below the title, there is a note where Simeon indicates that where his play was staged, or let's say it was intended to stage, in the monastery of Reverend Father Ksiądz Szembek. And it's concluded with the cryptogram following the Catholic model, which when deciphered read as follows: in honor of the Lord composed the play a certain Basilian in Vilno for Easter. The play can be classified as a type of theatrical declamation since it includes a prologue, an epilogue, and two parts. However, what sets the theatrical dialogue apart from mere declamation is presence of a plot and characters. In the verses on Good Friday, there are two allegorical figures, the soul and the angel. The soul represents an anagogical interpretation of the deer from the Psalms, seeking a source of water to quench its thirst. Only two, the so-called universal part, are indicated, the prologue and epilogue. However, the body of the play, if we examine it more closely, we can divide in two other scenes. Nevertheless, upon more careful examination, we can see the presence of the logical and compositional defined parts. The first scene is characterized by the cyclical, close plot. The action unfolds with the sense of the sorrow soul beneath the cross, and after subsequent change of seats in the Garden of Gethsemane, which the high priests Annas, Caiaphas, and Pilate, ending in the same place from which it began. The action and the scene depicted in the first part are indicated by the playwright remarks, where apparently presented on an open stage located in the church courtyard. The subsequent action of the play is then transferred to the interior of the great church, thus forming a separate part of the performance or the second concluding scene. In contrast of the first scene, where the audience could observe well-known gospel characters, presumably exhibited as mute figures. Actually, they don't speak. Soul or angel just refer to them, following emotional dialogues between the soul and the angel. The concluding scene has a plot entirely focused on the ceremony of laying down the symbolic attributes of the Christ's death. However, the main semantic link between the play is compositional center. It is the cross. Simeon, persistent emphasizing on drawing the audience attention to this attribute, suggests that the symbolic representation of the crucifixion is the main idea of the play, the highest didactic goal. The cross is surrounded by slightly less significant passion attribution, similar like mute figures of the mythical tormentors of Christ, but together they form the upper row and the hierarchy of the system of characters composed by Simeon. Some characters of Simeon Easter dialogues are static, while the others are active. In this aspect, he does not stand out from the other plays of Polish Catholic origin of this time. However, among the theatrical Easter Christmas dialogue of 17th century, it is difficult to find any other play where the allegorical character, the soul, displayed in such activity as it in Simeon play. The soul falls, it's lifted up, it's falling 3 times on the knee, laments, weeps, so soul is very active. Yes. Actually, it's quite unexpected because, you know, it's the 17th century. We're speaking about soul and angel. We shouldn't be expecting any kind of, let's say, dignity. No, it's a lot of passion. Yeah. Verses for Good Friday were introduced for a wide audience, so for the people of different level of literacy. According to the writer remarks, choruses were performed by children. We can see it in the manuscript. It's say the children walking through the church, which suggests the choruses sung by children. Perhaps that's explained why majority of choruses are written in Old Belarusian. The place written in the correct 13-syllable is a syllabic verse. The poet in his works introduced new theme and images, poetic genres, and forms into Belarusian poetry, touching upon previously unknown gestural issues, enriching literature as a whole. Drawing on local tradition and using the experience of Polish and Latin literature, he elevated syllabic poetry among the Eastern Slavs to higher level. Simeon of Polatsk was also one of the most prominent representative of the Baroque era, which can be considered as the first literary movement in East Slavic literature. A poet and dramatist, educator, and enlightener, he inscribed a brilliant page in the early modern history of East Slavic culture and theater culture of Belarus. At the end of the manuscript, you can see that's the anagram and the original orthograph of Simeon of Polatsk. It's the very bottom of the page. So thank you.
On the right.
Yes. And this is Anna Domini. There's his in the commemoration of the Christ's death, honored by, and this sign, it's a Simeon of Polatsk.
Mm-hmm.
And next, can we have next slide? Yeah. This is, you can see the combination of the Latin and the Cyrillic. I enlarge it that you can, you can see that that's a Cyrillic writing, and on the top we have Latin. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Alesia, for this very colorful presentation. Our next presenter and the last presenter, I understand that Arnold isn't here, is it? Is here, Yarik?
Not say him.
No, okay. So our last presenter today is Jakob Wunderwald, who is a researcher at the University of Potsdam in Germany. Jakob studied Slavic studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin, with studies abroad at the Tomsk State University in Russia and the Belarusian State University in Minsk. His MA was on Fear of Influence, Artist Love, and the Femininity of the State in Contemporary Belarusian Literature, in which he specifically dealt with the work of Alhierd Bacharevič and Viktor Martinovich. Since 2022, Jakob has been an academic assistant of Professor Dr. Brigitte Obermeier at the Institute for Slavic Studies at the University of Potsdam. There he's working on a dissertation project on the concept of truth in post-war Belarusian Soviet literature. His further research interests are application of postcolonial theory to post-socialist space, as well as critical theory. He also works as a translator from Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian. Jakob's topic today is Discontents in the post-war world, critical Belarusian literature and early post-colonial theory.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this panel and for this great experience of those 2 days here at the conference. What does postcolonial theory deal with? In his provocative essay, Is the Post in Postcolonial, the Post in Post-Soviet, published in 2001 and still read today in many Slavic studies classes worldwide, the American literary scholar David Chioni Moore attempts a definition. For him, postcolonial theory is the treatment of a space that can be summarized by the following minimal cultural similarities. Next slide, please. According to a rough consensus, the cultures of postcolonial lands are characterized by tensions between the desire for autonomy and the fact of hybrid part-colonial origin, between resistance and complicity, and between imitation or mimicry and hybridity. This minimal definition leads more to an astonished exclamation. If one takes his definition of the postcolonial seriously, then it becomes apparent, first, how extraordinarily postcolonial the societies of the former Soviet regions are, and second, how extraordinarily little attention is paid to this fact, at least in these terms, quote end. For Moore, the structuring of post-Soviet societies reveals precisely the same tensions between a desire for freedom and the fact, as he puts it, of a semi-colonial origin, between resistance and conformity, and between imitation and hybridity. For Moore, then, postcoloniality is first and foremost a descriptive marker to be observed in the cultural space of the countries concerned, and post-Soviet states fall under this descriptive marker. The second half of Moore's astonished exclamation can probably no longer necessarily be considered valid in this form. It seems to be the other way around. The post-coloniality of former Soviet territories is now regarded as a kind of consensus. In recent years, a number of monographs have appeared to take concepts of colonialism as a starting point for talking about the nature in post-socialist of life in post-socialist contexts. Moore's description of the post-Soviet situation as post-colonial seems to go hand in hand with a definition of the Soviet situation as colonial, as described by the Estonian literary scholar Epp Annus. Next slide, please. Who writes, thus Soviet ideology, together with totalitarian practice and colonial ideologies, created a complex fusion whereby Soviet colonial and totalitarian features merged, whereby communism signified colonialism, and whereby the colonial regime was enforced by totalitarian measures. In such a posing of the problem, various questions that arose at the beginning of the 21st century in the first attempts to apply post-colonial theories to post-Soviet territories seem to have been answered. For example, the seemingly deliberate failure to address the post-Soviet space by the most important thinkers of early post-colonial theory, such as Frantz Fanon, who you might have seen on the first slide staring at Vasil Biko. Because, to quote Epp Annus once again, next slide, please. While Marxists held no monopoly of anti-colonial discourse, it is nonetheless true that the most persistent, most vocal, and most dominant Western critics of colonialism were indeed, like Fanon and Sartre, Marxists. Thus, colonialism, as seen from the post-war perspective, appeared almost exclusively in the light of capitalist imperialism. So from this perspective too, Soviet colonialism was an oxymoron. The application of post-colonial theory to the post-Soviet space thus seems to be based on a certain categorical separation. The objective part of post-colonial, not really objective, but let's put it this way, objective part of post-colonial thought, hybridity, mimicry, Russification, etc., seems to have been detached from its subjective part, early post-colonial thinkers. I want to criticize this basic assumption with the help of Belarusian literature from the period after the Second World War. This seems to be the crux of the matter. Post-colonial theory was formulated, as also said here, in the post-war period, with the period's horizons in the background. These horizons seem to be what we are struggling with today. They can either be repressed, as in Anna's treatments, or as in the case of, for example, Sergei Ushakin, who writes on Belarus, simply pushed away in favor of a purely internal perspective. Here the question of how Belarusian intellectuals today think about their own post-coloniality takes center stage. This paper advocates a third perspective. It aims to point out through historicization how the discontents formulated in early post-colonial theory correspond to the discontents formulated at the same time, roughly, by critical writers from Belarus. So to quickly frame this through what Frantz Fanon wrote. Frantz Fanon, who is like the godfather of post-colonial theory in many ways, formulated seemingly contradictory goals in his political writings, which were written during his participation as a militant in the Algerian liberation movement FLN. On the one hand, he favors an irreconcilable struggle against the French colonial regime, which can only be the work of the colonially oppressed themselves, Algeria against Europe. At the same time, he outlines a quote, humanism with universal dimensions as the horizon behind successful colonial liberation, where it would be possible for the formerly oppressed peoples to draw on the riches of the world themselves. National liberation for Fanon is therefore not a value in itself, rather it is a political means of realizing a more far-reaching global liberation. According to Fanon, this is made impossible by a situation in which the values of the so-called free world, values of freedom, have turned into means of oppression. What Fanon is saying here, and don't want to go into this too deeply to not bore you, what Fanon is saying here comes from the oppositional talent, but also the disappointment of a political thinker whose entire thought arose from the confrontation with the values of freedom that are often referred to as French values, liberty, equality, fraternity. As a young man, still a teenager, Fanon went to Europe on his own initiative to defend these values. He fought in the Free French Army against fascism, but in his struggle in Europe, Fanon saw what he thought was a continuation of a revolutionary fight for freedom and the spirit of the French Revolution as something different. In 1944, Fanon wrote to his brother about his experience in the French army. Listen to me, I've grown a lot older than you. I've been deceived and I'm paying for my mistakes. I'm sick of it all. In a letter to his parents, he qualifies the deception even further. Next slide, please. If one day you should learn that I died facing the enemy, console each other, but never say he died for a good cause. Say God called him back to him. The false ideology that shields the secularists and the idiot politicians must not delude us any longer. I was wrong. Fanon writes of a problem, an ideology that shields itself from reality and reality from itself. France did not correspond to its own values. The Second World War no longer presented itself as a war of liberation, but rather turned into its opposite. Fascism may have been defeated, but freedom had not been achieved. The world remained one of authoritarian states in which lack of freedom might be modified, but not abolished. It was precisely this liberation that made Fanon into an anti-colonial fighter in the post-war period. The post-war did not fulfill the promise made by the victory in the Second World War. It is not an anti-fascist world in the sense that the nations that participate in the struggle against fascism could live freely. Colonial peoples are condemned to live as wretched of the earth. Accordingly, Fanon speaks of the spirit of the French Revolution, which should cause every Frenchman to side with him, with colonial Algeria, but does not. The wretched of the earth, as which Fanon, in his major works title, describes the colonially oppressed, meaning those caught in colonial barbarism, are in so far concretely a category of the post-war period. The oppression only appears in its entirety where the post-war world cannot abolish it. Enough framing. To Belarusian literature. Bykov and Karalina Matskievich. Why is this important? What does this have to do with Belarusian literature? Perhaps first of all this. Frantz Fanon, who has now been talked about at length, counts the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre among his main influences. In research and literary discourse, one of the most influential Belarusian writers of the post-war period, Vasil Bykov, is often also referred to as existentialists. The parallels do not end here. If you look more closely, you will notice a number of things that connect Bykov and Fanon. To highlight just a few brief biographical parallels, Bykov and Fanon are roughly the same age. Fanon was born in 1925, Bykov in 1924. They each come from the periphery of one of the great empires of the 20th century. Fanon from the French colony of Martinique, Bykov from Soviet Belarus. They both leave their homelands during World War II to fight in their empire's army. For both of them, French existentialism, as I said, represents an important point of orientation in their work. Both meet Jean-Paul Sartre exactly once in their lives and in the same city, in Rome, Fanon in 1961, Bykov in 1965. And for both of them, the decisive factor in these meetings was Sartre's position on the question of imperial oppression. Fanon motivated Sartre in Rome to write the preface to his main work, Wretched of the Earth, and Bykov recalled Sartre's rejection of the Gulag in his autobiography, Darora da Domo. Next slide, please. I think, once further. Thank you. Quote, this is Bykov describing him seeing Sartre at this Congress. Na Конгрессе Гаворка йшла про літературний авангард, відомо ж заходний, у нас тоді свого ще не було. Там же у залі посідження стало відомо про арешт у Москві Синявського і Даніеля, і мені дуже сподобалося, як Simeon негучно сказав, що арешт поета завжди ганьба для ураду. Його, однак, ніхто не підтримав, ти мало хто і почув. Ми уважливо і з некоторим здивленням слухали глибокодумні виступи Сартра, режисера Антоніоні, Джона Карла Вігарелі, які говорили зовсім не так і не про те, що ми привикли чути на радімі. Особливо, тут важно, особливо уразив Сартр своїми філософськими експромтами про екзистенціалізм. Розумно він говорив Сартр, а я думав, що усе ж правда, мабуть, на боку його земляка Кам'ю, який зранив СССР за канцляри, а Сартр за те порвав всім відносини. We see Bykov meets the anti-colonial thinker Sartre, whom contemporary post-colonial critique like that of Annos would want to completely separate from his Soviet experience and can see something in him. Sartre's critique of Sartre's non-critique of the Soviet Union echoes him in, and he knows the concepts around which the dispute between those two thinkers like Sartre and Camus revolves. Bykov is able to develop a position on the subjective side of the debates of his time. He lives in a global world like those people do. The crisis of this world is being dealt with on both sides of the Iron Curtain. What does that mean in concrete terms? To look at it, because there's not enough time here for more, with the help of a concrete example. In his story Obelisk, Bykov sketches a critique that questions Soviet reality before its own pretensions. Starting from a central, ubiquitous element of Soviet memory culture, the obelisk for the heroes in the village square, the memory culture's insufficiency is negotiated. The names immortalized on the obelisk as heroes of the partisan struggle do not reflect the truth about the war. Rather, in them, the anti-fascist struggle, the memory of it, becomes a moment of organizing domination in the post-war world. The narrator of Obelisk is taught a different version of the story remembered on the obelisk, and thus becomes the place where the contradiction is negotiated. He is told conflicting versions of a story. One is about a death-defying young teacher who cooperates with the partisans under occupation and teaches the students values of courage and sacrifice that eventually motivate him to perform the heroic deed recalled on the obelisk. The other story is the one told by the authorities, in which the teacher was above all a careless romantic who put the partisan action controlled by the authorities in danger for no reason. In the post-war world, memory gains its value not from its truth, but from its usefulness for the ideological project of the Soviet Union. This makes contradictory what was not contradictory in this form in wartime. The last lines of the narrative make this clear. Махчима, кожен із їх по-своєму був правий, але хто правий найбільш, этого я не ведав. This is the narrator speaking. Two possible truths stand side by side, but there must be one that is truer. Two narratives of the war have indeed become incompatible with each other in the post-war world. They can only be held up violently against each other. The well-deserved ideology of a party functionary for the teacher and veteran of the partisan struggle who died young thus becomes in its specificity an expression of a suppression of the past for the purpose of stabilizing the present. Next slide, please. I might not read this to save some time, but what is going on here is that two perspectives on the war are brought out. In between those perspectives, there can be no reconciliation in looking at history. Where a person has died, there can be no success. This is what someone who took part in the war says to a party man who did not. So the point is not that there was anything wrong with the war, but the other way around. The fault lies in today. In it, there's only place for a memory of oppression for the lives lost in the war, and place, The victory over fascism in Bykow's Belarusian perspectives turns into just another transformation of a centuries-long oppression. In this respect, the Belarusians are just wretched of the earth. They become such after the Second World War, at the time when Frantz Fanon also opens up this category. The novella underlines this in its form, which places the frame story in a contemporary Belarus against the past of the internal story. The goal, as formulated at the end of the text, is to establish a new relationship with the past. The reality of the present-day narrative does not do justice to the war, which it constantly carries before it as its ideological center. To give just another short example, and I hope I'm not talking too here. In Kalasipat Siarpomtvaim from 1963, Vladimir Karadkevich constructs a revolution that is a spirit of revolution, more so, that is essentially intertwined with the aristocrats of the Dnipro region. At the same time, he always embeds it in a Belarus in which the possibilities of freedom of a Europe that is already undergoing revolutionary upheaval must also be considered. The Belarus in which the novel is set is integrated into the processes that began with the French Revolution. The framework that the novel sets for self-liberation thus points beyond the essential. It hints at more global possibilities of emancipation. At the same time, Karadkevich goes back to the starting point of revolutionary dawn, concretely on the territory of today's Belarus, in order to postulate a different model of emancipation in a state that sees itself as the result of a revolutionary process of self-liberation, the Soviet Union. Karadkevich's return to the revolutionary spirit of the lands on the Dnipro postulates the unfulfilled nature of a revolutionary project that dates back to the time of the formulation of a national need in the Kalinowski uprising of 1863. Karadkevich's novel thus asks for new possibilities of subjectivization in history. It can only do this by ontologizing the revolutionary potential through the figure of Alessandro, who carries the revolutionary spirit in the country with him. Such an ontologization, though, has a critical effect where it nevertheless reveals a broader horizon than the one surrounding it, in this case, the Soviet world. To conclude, in the 1960s, Frantz Fanon formulated, for example, a vision of a critical national culture that could develop a position on the present by returning to national founding moments. His critique is about potentials that remained unfulfilled in history and only became visible through a return to only became visible after the failure of the post-war world, and then could be made visible through a return to another historical point. In this form, the potential of the founding moment, as for example in Karadkevich, becomes the foil against which the present would have to justify itself. And this is precisely what Karadkevich does with regard to the uprising of 1863 and what Bykow does with the founding myth of Soviet Belarus, the Second World War. In this respect, they are very much contemporaries of the origins of what later became post-colonial thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob, and thank you to all of the presenters. We've heard 4 fascinating papers. We are now moving to the discussion, and welcome to everyone to ask questions and offer comments. Do we have anybody in the... Yeah, Alessandro.
Thank you very much to my great co-panelists. I have one question for Alesia and one for Jakob. So for Alesia, when we think about figures such as Simeon Polatsk, I'm not a scholar of that period, but studying that period as a student and then reading on it later, I've always noticed that scholars maybe struggle with national canons and issues of literary history. So do you think that a figure such as Simeon Polatsk should be seen mostly as part of the Belarusian literary history, or that his work in different periods of his life should fit different literary histories? In one period the Belarusian, in a later one maybe the Russian, but you've also used the idea of East Slavic culture in a way. So how do you work with these concepts and with the different national canons? And then the second question, it's not a question, I don't know, it's just an idea that I've had listening to you, Jakob, to your very fascinating paper. So what you said about Bika and Karatkevich and the parallels between the Belarusian situation and Western post-colonial thinkers, in a way, I couldn't help thinking about Mykola Kryvoi in Ukraine, even if, of course, I mean, he lived and wrote in the 20s. As we know, he committed suicide in 1933. So, of course, his context is different. I was just thinking if we still may see some parallels between what he did and the context you talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, don't you mind? I will just read it. Believe me, I expected this question. So you can be my witness. Yeah. Simeon of Polatsk was Belarusian poet, representative of the late European Baroque era. In 1656, in 1664, he relocated to Moscow in 17th century, where here in Moscow was neither poetic nor literary language. And this is I'm taken from actually Tikhonravov. That's one of the greatest researchers of 19th century. He is a Russian imperialistic researcher. I'm very capable to read the 19th century literature, and it was the first researches about what happened in Moscow and how it was developed. Simeon was the first to introduce syllabic poetry to Muscovites. That's a fact, right? I hope you agree. Simeon of Polatsk introduced syllabic poetry to Muscovites. Simeon of Polatsk, the founder of Russian syllabic poetry, that's as well, and it's historical fact. It is absolutely the same like the German composer Handel. He's the founder of English oratorio, and that's as well undeniable fact. But nobody called him British. So even moving to work in another country does not change your nationality. That's the last phrase I wrote. So how do I take it? I take the Simeon of Polatsk as representative of wider culture. He's not represents Russian culture. We can speak about him as representative of East Slavic culture, representative of Baroque culture. At this time, if we compare in Moscow, there was no educational establishment, theater was forbidden, no poetry, and as what is actually everybody forgets why Simeon of Polatsk moved to Moscow. War. Point number one. Point number two, he was undeniably invited to become a translator. He didn't move as a poet, first of all, and whom he taught the local KGB, because there was no people capable of speaking other languages. Do you know why? Because actually to speak another language was a sin. So we have quite unprecedented, historical situation. So no, I don't consider him as Russian by any means. He's Belarusian. Point number one. Point number two, what he represents? The Baroque poetry of 17th century. For me, this is like this. If we speak about his citizenship, That can be several opinions, I would agree. I hope I satisfied you.
Yeah, I can attest that this was written. I think that what I'm trying to get my head around and what this is like still a work in progress about is that I think one can, of course, and this, for example, also happens with Belarusian literature, for example, in Simon Lewis's monograph on Belarusian literature, which appeared a few years ago. He will talk about Kupala and Fanon and stuff like that. But I'm really not convinced by this in many ways because it, while of course in the descriptions in which Fanon uses for the colonial situation, you can always find parallels in the countries colonized by the Russian Empire. It does not really correspond to the situation out of which the critique is formulated. And I think this is the part which I would find interesting. How can we actually mark a historical moment where on a global level, people were thinking about questions of freedom arising out of the failure of liberation in the 20th century. And this would be, this would be the point. But while still, of course, I think it can be fruitful to think about those thinkers in different constellations. Yeah.
Any more questions from the floor? Yarik, can you open it?
No, they can just ask the question.
But maybe they have
Invite to ask the question.
Oh, yes, yeah. I can't see who it is, but yes, go ahead.
Julia shouldn't show it.
Maybe she doesn't hear.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have two questions, so I'll be very quick. And my first one is for Hannah Horn. I was wondering about the last point, one of the last points that were in your presentation about the non-possibility of nostalgia for the Belarus that was before 2020, that is seen in Zemirovskaya writing on Facebook. And what I was thinking is that it is, of course, very must be painful matter to not be able to relate to 2020 Belarus once one was not there and have not gone through experiences there, and now is prohibiting oneself to have this nostalgia for what was before. However, one has not seen what was after that or during that. And that is connecting to me to what is happening in her fiction, her latest story called Mroi, Deepfakey and Ikambeki, published in Lit Radio magazine last month. That is a very violent manifestation of the same topic, where one of the heroines is starting to recognize Vyazenka in New York City and having these waves of nostalgia. But this time it is for true. She is truly in Belarus, Vyazenka, and it all is happening to her, which is not something like what was happening in Смерти нет, because there was this actual act of travel. The person needed to go on a plane and go to a different land to become in this nostalgic world. But in this new story, it just happens rapidly. And what is also interesting here is Zemirovskaya's use of Belarusian language, because it's very abundant in that version of the story published in Lit Radio. One of the characters speak Belarusians a lot, and there are big portions of Belarusian language. So my question would be about these language matter in Facebook writing in relation to nostalgia matters. Does Zemirovskaya tends to use Belarusian language where she makes these connections to the Belarusian land pre or post 2020, or is it reserved for fiction more for now, if that was something that you were looking to and making connections? And my second question is for Dr. Achilli, whom I'm very happy to see almost in person, and the question was about the use of irony in Bacharevič if that was something that you were also looking into. Is there a tendency to maybe divert from it in the recent writing after 2020? Because from the examples that you demonstrated, it is of course striking how much irony there is in the earlier texts, and I believe that you might, if you want, like speak about the connections and traditions in Belarusian contemporary poetry of doing so. Like I would say, like Andrei Khednovich is also one of the writers that would do that in poetry. But after the events of 2020, and maybe after the catastrophic events of 2022 and further on, I would say that irony might not be the most accessible tool to access the reality, if we can say that. And if you would say that this is something that is reflected in the writing and in the collection you were looking on. Thank you so much.
So I will answer the first question then. Thank you so much for the questions. And on the first part of it, I actually looked into that short story published on Literario, and I was thinking how it is very connected to what I'm researching. And it's, yeah, so it's interesting what you mentioned about the experience and place and seeing or not seeing what has happened indeed in Belarus of 2020 as a place. And I would say that here we deal with this dimension of repression when also the writing of one can be a reason to detain other people. So a writer then is more aware also, like, even if he or she or they're not living in the country or haven't been to the protests directly in Belarus, they are still aware of the consequences which may come. And for example, making posts not private or deleting them, or just being more aware of it. And in my conversations with Tatiana Zamirovskaya, I felt that it can also be studied through this angle. So it was not an experience on site, but rather taking care of one's own presence online through understanding of other peoples who are on site in Belarus. And maybe answering the second part of it, language matter. To be honest, I got the feeling that Belarusian in her writing, online writing, might be very connected to the othering of oneself from Russian culture, so to say, or self-exotization from time to time. I will not really claim it as an instrument because I don't feel that I have enough evidence of that. But I think that if one takes more look into her life journal writing, when the posts are quite lengthy and it's a lot of motives are intertwined there, I think, one might say so. But at the moment, I wouldn't say so. And what else? There was actually a very good post in 2020 on this Batska narrative, on how Russians talk about Lukashenko, naming him Batska, but no one from Belarus really names him so. And maybe this word can also be from the Belarusian language, like treated from this language too. Yes.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your question. I think what you said is definitely something to keep in mind. And indeed, in his pre-2020 poetry, I would say there is a lot of irony. While it's way difficult to find irony in the poetry written in 2020, 2021, and as I mentioned, the most recent poems published in this book are those from 2021. There are a lot of tragic notes. So, for example, I was rereading these poems set in Trieste, which has an Italian language title, La Scala Notturna. And the last stanza sounds like that. Няхай я не верят, что все буде лепее, чем есть. Няхай я не верю, что все тут закрутится знову. Хотел бы и я в это верить, сходячи с темной скалы, ходой божеволка, расхубленный пьяный, никим не запомненный хость. it's indeed difficult to find irony in a poetic worldview like this. So I will definitely keep your remark in mind while working on a longer version of this paper. Thank you again.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Yeah. Jim, that someone supposed to read Arnold's paper, but
Is there anyone online who was going to read out Arnold's paper? I've checked my emails and I have nothing from him.
We have several Arnold's books here.
Next.
People can relate the one from the 1970s and one from the 21st century.
Yes, and Arnold has been a presenter at the conference, at the literary panel of the conference, practically every year, and we are missing him this year and wishing him all the best as he's feeling unwell. It's a shame we cannot hear his paper, but we're looking forward to him publishing his research, and yes, as I said, wishing him all the best. Any more questions? Just yeah.
First of all, the question, have you ever came across the performance of Belarus Free Theater of Собаки Европы?
No, not that one, unfortunately. No.
You know, think is the just, I mean, it's quite significant performance. I've seen it in Barbican, and I came with a friend of mine who she doesn't speak neither Russian nor Belarusian. She's from Lebanon. And the thing is the emotionally and how the dramaturgically it was built up according to the action and the scenes built up. Everything was very evident, but it was quite significant because it was about 5 days after the war started. So I'm afraid that's, don't you think that any poet or any writer resonates with the world around? And for example, some poetical, let's say, sadness or some poetical humor can disappear, not because the writer wants to be serious, but because the writer just resonates with what was surrounded. That's the question, really, your opinion as a person. And the one question to you, do you think that somehow colonization and cultural appropriation are always working together? Or you think that it's pretty much because, as we can see from the expansion of Russian Empire to Belarus and Ukraine, it's enormous amount of cultural appropriations. And it's quite difficult to, to understand them. It's quite difficult to find them because it's people of the same Christian belief, people of the same race. So quite often, cultural appropriation became quite impossible because, for example, of the difference of the religious or racial or cultural. How it's funny. What do you think? Can we link cultural appropriation and colonization?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I wanted
Okay.
to.
So thank you very much, Alesia. This is fascinating, and indeed this would need more thinking than I can at the moment. I'm thinking about other Belarusian writers, for example, who had a lot again of irony in their former writing, and they tend to be much more tragic in the present. For example, Sergei Prilutsky, again, that's the first example that comes to my mind. But I'm still sure that there can be irony and playfulness even in tragic context. So maybe it would be indeed very interesting to reflect more along this line and see how irony and playfulness survive in tragic context. So thank you very much for giving me this idea. We'll definitely think about this. Thank you.
I maybe have to ask back, cultural appropriation by whom? You mean in a sense of
When
the
domination nation takes something from the nation it's conquered, let's say, and sell it in the world market as their own.
Yeah. I think that in many ways, yes. I think like that would like at least also be like what I think the theory would say, that this is one of the processes that is always happening. I think the interesting question is this Right. There is, for example, when you look at Bykov, and Bykov is in many ways a very Soviet writer, right? Like he writes on the narratives that are pushed by the Soviet state. He writes about the war. He writes like, although not really, many of his like stories are like hero stories, where like in the end you have like a good character who prevails, or at least like whose moral prevails, even if he doesn't. But like we know him. But on the other hand, through appropriating this this form, he, if you say so, as the colonized writer, actually writes something more. He gives some of his own experience through the war, his experience as a Belarusian writer, into these narratives, and makes it something more, which can be read in several ways, which in a way like fractures. And I think this is like what you would call hybridity. Yeah. And like, right on the other hand, again, of course, if you read Bykov in German, you will find that he, during GDR times, was basically brought to the GDR as a Russian writer. His works were translated from Russian. And I even was told by a colleague who was from Russia that they read Bykov in school as like a Russian writer, and he didn't know that he is a Belarusian writer until I told him. So yeah, I think like the interesting, and I think this was also what I was trying to get at in the talk, the interesting part when thinking about this is when appropriating things, when this contact between colonized and colonizer happens, what horizons do artists point to when they work through this? When they appropriate something, or when they are appropriated, what does this point to? And this is what I'm interested in.
That's why I asked, just like from the point of 17th century, you see, that's interesting fact that it's started very long time ago, and we consider it as something new, which has a long history. So thank you so much. That's really helpful what you said about hybrid. It's
Sorry, I was just thinking again
Yeah.
about the question of like poetry in its time. And for example, the example of Dmitry Strotsev came to my mind. And if you take his poetry from the summer of 2020, it's extremely diverse. So you have messianic poems, you have tragic poems, you do have ironic poems, for example, the one in which he criticized the European chinovniki and so on. So, well, yeah, see, poetry, I guess, poetic language can be very, very diverse, even in one context, also a tragic one, for example. So you can still have very different styles coming out even from one writer, one poet in just one context. So.
And can I continue this this line of thought to Simeon of Polatsk writing? You mentioned his how he played his playfulness in his texts. And irony, but he was writing on very serious religious topics like verses on Good Friday. So how would his irony or sense of humor or playfulness would manifest in those religious writings, and to what extent it was daring to his time?
Thing is that again he was following the Ratio Studiorum, the rules of Neo-Latin poetry, which any kind of sarcastic poetics were very common. And let's say he quite famous, speaking about his humorous, it's pretty much like epigrams. I wouldn't say that he has any kind of humorous moments in the verses on Good Friday. But what is interesting, he portrayed very vivid character, the soul. So he paint the soul like very tormented figure. This character, the soul, is very alive. And the reaction, because he wrote, he actually, let's say he give you a lot of directing suggestions. So pretty much it's not only a play, it's a description how to stage it. Later on, he will continue it with the prodigal son. And the court of Tsar Alexis. But in the verses of Good Friday, there is not pretty much humor, I would say. But for example, he creates the situation like in Gethsemane said, when he refer the angel point the soul, have a look at this person, and he speaks with Caiapha, but Caiapha doesn't reply. So he instead of portrait it as a continuous suffer, he portraits this way of soul as a discovery. I mean, that's my understanding of Simeon of Polatsk. That he portrays, you know, it's another thing. How do we understand the dramaturgy? Thing is that when we read the play, somebody says that when you write the novel, it's for one person, when you write the play, it's for thousands. Because when I read the novel, I have my own impression. If, for example, I stage the play, I should appeal to a lot of people who will come and see it. And to be honest, it's like if you will ask person after the performance, what do they understand? You can get 10 different opinions. So my opinion from Simeon of Polotsk, that he make it very vivid, and it's not about suffer, about discovery, what is interesting. And let's say later on, when he moved to Moscow, he will find a lot of obstacles on his way, because he will be misunderstood. He will be called Latin. He will be called pro-pope. He will meet a lot of things. And first, what he is doing, what I really like, he create the printing house, which is free of sense of the patriarch. So he decided, okay, if I can show it, I will write it.
Thank you. Thank you. And if I may, just one last very short question to Alessandro. You were talking about the book by Bacharevič written in both Latynka and Cyrillic script. As a Western researcher, how do you see the role, the function, and the future of Latynka in communication of Belarusian literature?
Thank you very much, Karalina, but I think it's a very it's a very difficult question for me to answer. So my impression is that in a way, Latynka is making a comeback. That's my impression. And well, maybe, I don't know, we might expect it to function in such a way that it helps foreign audiences understand that Belarusian is a different language from Russian, because that is something that I guess most people out there are not aware of. At the same time, it is also a way of, I guess, again, showing foreign audiences that the Belarusian language can be understood, appreciated, and the Belarusian culture can be appreciated outside of a particular context that, in a way, has it closer to the Russian, to the East Slavic, and also to the Orthodox tradition, maybe. So I don't know. It can be an interesting strategy of, in a way, approaching, inviting foreign readers to at least question their prejudices about Belarusian culture. But again, of course, for this to happen, the promotion of Belarusian literature and culture must be supported in all possible ways, because, and of course, the main weapon that we have to promote it is, of course, translation. And yeah, for example, if I were to translate this book, I might consider, and of course, I mean, I don't see the point of translating poetry without parallel text. So a good idea might be to go for the Latynka version on the right-left side of the page, and the translation on the right. So basically to ignore the Cyrillic Tarashkevitsa version. If I were to translate this book, that would be my choice. Also, I mean, to respect the author's choice. I mean, I get to understand that for him, this is the main text. And again, this is the transliteration of translation. So yeah, I would have the original version here and the translation here, and this would be the original, not this one.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think like what would be great in academic context, I don't know how about the English situation, but in Germany, when I write about something Belarusian, I have to use transliteration from the Cyrillic to whenever I encounter a Belarusian word or name. And I think it's so weird that when you like, there is a fully functioning Latin script, that it's basically like, it's not really allowed to use it. And yeah, I think this would be good if this would in some way be pushed forward by Western scholars.
Also the different versions of the Latinka thing may be an obstacle to this.
Yeah.
Because there's more than
somehow centralized, and in this case, this name should be written like, again, composer Dvorak. You know, he's written with a special letter, otherwise you will read wrong.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's been the most stimulating discussion and a very good ending to the conference. I will pass on the microphone to Yarik.
Thank you very much, Karalina, for moderating this discussion. Speaking of Latinka, actually, Nasha Niva, one of leading Belarusian independent newspapers, has a version in Latin script as well. So if you go to the top, there's letter L, and then all news will be in Latin. And also for there is a way, there is a unified approach to Latinka, which was supported actually by the Belarusian state. They put together like a transliteration guide, and it's available online. And this is something which we recommend to use for the Journal of Belarusian Studies. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's I think we should just stick to that version, which is not too bad. And
So the German dictionary.
yeah, so that you will have a guide in a month.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, so on this, okay, go ahead.
Just to extend a little bit this topic, the problems for researchers of Belarusian literature in transliterating their names come from the fact that the Library of Congress authority file, VIAF, has no Belarusian transliteration, neither in Latinic nor in Cyrillic. And we have to go by the Polish, Czech, other national transliterations of Belarusian names. And that is for librarians to sort out. And we are here in the Skaryna library. The National Library of Belarus has never come around to sorting that out. So that is a huge problem, and hopefully will be sorted in the next few years. Thank you.
Yes, and that's, I think, particularly important given that in Belarus we see more efforts to marginalize Latin script, to push it aside, just to pretend that it never existed.